point of no return is something that we romanticize. You know, we see movies about it, and it's usually this moment in the movie where we're faced with a climax of some sort, and somebody says, "Oh, we're at the point of no return." And that's kind of neat for movies, and it's kind of okay for life, but here's the truth of the matter. The moment you were born, you were at the point of no return. Do you realize that? See, at the moment you were born, you were at the point of no return. You have to do something with your life now. Now, we're not thinking about that when we come out of the womb. You know, we're just thinking, hey, we want food, we want to be changed, we want all that kind of stuff. We're getting used to life, and as we get older, we're getting used to life. We're trying to figure out what it is that we're supposed to do, but every single one of us are at a point of no return, because here is the truth, and this isn't a big revelation for you this morning, but the truth is this, is we have all been given one life to live for Jesus. One life to live for Jesus. So it is important that we save nothing for the next life. Because there's nothing in this life that we get to take with us into eternity. That there's nothing that we have, there's nothing that we have accomplished, there's nothing that we have made in our own life that takes us to eternity. It's just what we do with this life. What we do with this life for Jesus. And I ran across a book, and it's kind of what the name of the series is about. It's the Last Arrow, and it's a book by a guy by the name of Erwin McManus, and he pastors a church in Los Angeles, and when he wrote this book, he'd finished writing this book, and then he had a doctor's appointment after he was writing the book. Went to this doctor's appointment because he was in some other businesses, and there's some insurance things that needed to take place so that if anything were to happen to him, whoever he was in partnership with wouldn't be stuck with bills and all that kind of stuff. So he thought it wasn't going to be any big deal. So he goes in for this appointment. He feels healthy. Everything is wonderful, except for the fact that they say, we can't tell you what's wrong with you. We just know that there's something wrong with you. And so they couldn't give him the insurance clearance. And so the game began after that of going and taking tests, and test after test were taking place. And so him and his wife went to the doctor's office on Christmas Eve of all days, about a year ago, thinking that everything was going to be fine, that they were going to say, hey, there's this big mistake, you feel good, you're healthy, and we're going to be able to help you. And then he was diagnosed with cancer. He didn't feel bad. Nothing about his life was going wrong. There wasn't anything that indicated that, but in that moment, he was devastated. To have to go on Christmas Eve and to tell his kids, instead of everything is okay, I have cancer. And so he'd already finished writing this book before all of that. And so when he went back to this book, and this book took on a new meaning for him. This idea of, what am I going to do with this life? What am I going to do with it? Now the good news is, if you're waiting on the edge of your seat, he is in remission, and he has gone through treatment, and there's been really positive steps with his condition. And so that's a good thing, because I don't want you to get stuck there and miss the rest of the message. But he has this quote that from his book that I read that I want to read to you. And the quote goes like this. It says, "I wonder how many victories are lost before the battle has even begun. I wonder how much more God desires to usher into the world. Desires to usher into the world that has been thwarted by our own lack of ambition. I wonder how many times in my own life I thought I failed, but actually the only thing that happened was I quit." And I got to tell you, as I read this quote in the book, and as I was preparing for this message, this quote has really been at the heart of most of what I've dealt with my entire life. Most of my entire life, I wondered, What is it that maybe I didn't achieve because I got to the place where it just got too hard, where I got to the place where it seemed like I was going to fail, where I got to the place where I thought this was a failure, but the only reason it was a failure was maybe because I quit. Maybe that was the worst thing I did, but maybe the other part is how many things that did I not accomplish because I never took a shot. You see, as I've thought about this quote, I can't help but wonder how many times that I've missed something really incredible simply because I didn't have the courage or the stick-to-itiveness to hold on to the course that God had called me to. How many times had I settled for safe instead of taking a shot, not worrying about what other people would think about me or whether it would be easy or whether it would be accepted? These are the questions that I ask myself personally all the time. And what makes this a hard question to answer is sometimes we will never know what God was going to do because we quit. Because it was hard, because we labeled it a failure, because we didn't understand it. And so we didn't follow through, and we'll never know what God could have done in those moments. And so when we step into the new year, I think we should all think about these kinds of questions. These are all questions that we should have, not so that we wonder, hey, what could life have been, but maybe so that we can begin to answer the question, what should life be from here on out? Especially for the Christian, especially for us as people. You know, we get into a place where everything is wonderful sometimes, or maybe everything is not wonderful sometimes, and we just kind of camp there. When Cricket and I began to feel the release from our last pastorate, I got to tell you, it was a really scary time. All the other times that we had moved from place to place, it was because we had been there a relatively short period of time. And so anywhere from 2 years to 5 years, you know, when you're moving from one place to another after 2 years to 5 years, it's rough, it's a little bit difficult, but it's not as bad as being somewhere for 11 years. And being in a place where you've seen all kinds of wonderful things happen, that you've seen dreams come true that God has given you in your church, to be involved not only in the church, but in the community. And when God began to speak to us and take us to different places to interview, it was a really scary time. Because we knew that in saying yes to any of these other places, we were going to be saying no to something that was really comfortable. It wasn't the typical story when we got to that place. It wasn't that 11 years and everybody hated me and I had to go. It wasn't that story of you know what, I hate this place so much and man, I can't handle this place anymore. There was this real love, there was this real connection, and all of a sudden God was saying, hey, it's time for you to think about something else. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. Says things are going exactly the way that I want them here. And all of a sudden you're wanting to move me? Folks, it's scary. And we would go to place. We interviewed probably a dozen places. And each place I would come up with a reason not to go. Each place, when Cricket and I would interview, we would sit there and we'd say, oh, you know, you guys are wonderful. And then we would go home and we would just kind of agree, we just don't feel like this is where God has called us. And then you screwed it up. Because we came and we talked and we got to know some of you and then we prayed about it. Can I just give you a piece of advice? Don't ever pray about something if you don't want God to really do something in your life. But even in that midst of meeting with you and feeling a call, it was difficult. The questions started swirling in my mind. Was things like what if they don't like me? What if I'm reading this all wrong? What if I really am not that good? And what if I'm not the leader that they need to help them to fulfill the dream that God has for them? And so then the questions began to really pile up in my brain. And at the end of the day, what happened was God began to prompt me that Broken Arrow Church of the Nazarene was the place that he was calling me to be. And he said basically to me, not in an audible voice, but he impressed upon me that if I would just be obedient, if I would trust God, and if I would be who he made me to be, the ministry that we would have here would be greater than any ministry that we'd had anywhere else. Because God has a plan to reach people through you. And that's where I didn't really expect a lot of amens during then, because whenever we talk about God expects to do ministry and reach people, and then you add the part to through you, then that's when our questions start. That's when we begin to struggle. That's when we begin to wonder, okay, what it is that you're talking about? My life is so full right now. I've got so much stuff going on. I got all of these things that are happening in my life right now. And I don't know, Lord, if I can handle one more thing. And so, Lord, if you want to do something, that's fine, but you got to do it without me. And even in the midst of some of that, we got some really good excuses, whether it's, hey, I got kids and they're involved in a lot of stuff, or you know what, I retired and you know what, I don't get around like I used to, or you know what, I already do a lot at the church, and so, Lord, I can't possibly do anything else, in the church. And so then we begin to, if we're not careful, to embrace these excuses that maybe keep us from experiencing everything that God has for us. A future greater than anything that we could possibly imagine. You see, the other thing that I had to come to grips with is that it wasn't only that God wanted to do something through you and me together, it was that it was going to be different than anything that I had ever thought of in my life. Can I just be totally honest with you right now? And this is going to be a dangerous confession. I really don't have the slightest clue what God's going to do through us. But that's okay. Because it means that we have to totally rely on who he is. And instead of schemes of what the future looks like, instead of trying to figure out, what it is that we're really shooting for. And I'm all about goals. If you come to a board meeting, I'm all about those kinds of things. I'm all about vision. I'm all about mission. I'm all about that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, what I have to do is I have to abandon my dream. And I have to embrace God's dream. Whatever that is. And I've been doing ministry for over 20 years, and let me tell you the one thing that I've learned, it is always, always, always different than what I thought it was supposed to be. And it's always, always different from the way it used to be. Because God is still a creative God. God is still a God that moves. God is still a God of power. God is still a God that wants to do something incredible through us. And all I know is this, is that when I come to the end of my life, I want to be able to move from this life to the next, completely spent. I don't have any desire to hold anything for the next life. In the last couple of months, I've said goodbye to 2 mentors. Stan Toller, some of you know, passed away a few months ago. And another one that I just went up to last week, some of you might know him if you were in the Kansas area at some point, but he was a district superintendent by the name of Jim Dillow. And Jim Dillow and Stan, two very different people. You know, Stan kind of, even though he was about that tall, was bigger than life, really outgoing, wrote hundreds of books, went everywhere all over the world, was elected general superintendent, had seen all kinds of wonderful things and invested in hundreds, if not thousands, of pastors' lives and done wonderful things. And so when you go to his funeral, you see all the people that are excited and celebrating a life well lived. And then Jim Dillow, he was very different. He was a little bit taller, a little bit whiter than he was, but very quiet man, very, very, very subdued, never really ministered, terribly far from where he grew up. And then when you go to his funeral, you see and hear of the thousands of people that he influenced in his life. And the thing that they both had in common was this, is both of them came from very humble beginnings. And they both accomplished fantastic things for the Lord. The other thing that they had in common was they both served God up until the day that they died. Jim Dillow's last sermon was Christmas Eve morning, before he went on to be with the Lord just a few days later. Both of those men modeled this radical obedience, this thought that I'm not saving anything for the next life. You see, I believe we all want to live this type of life. I believe we all want God's very best for us. Deep in our hearts, we know the dreams that God has placed there, and we long to see those dreams come true. But I think that many of us either do not take our shot, or worse yet, we quit early, either because we have a low view of our ability or a fear of what other people think of us. We seem to think that we have to fit in this picture. We seem to think that we have to fit in this idea of what Christianity is. When God says, I've blown that to pieces the day that I sent Emmanuel, God, with you. The day that Jesus came and was born in a manger, he blew everything to smithereens as far as what religious practice thought. He said, from the very beginning, you should know better. From the very beginning, you should know that there's more to this life for you. I can remember at one time we were launching this new ministry, and there was a bar in town that's called Sharky's, and with our associates, and I would always ask the question in the staff meeting, is we would say, what would appeal to the Sharky's crowd? And so we would do things that would reach people that were coming out of places of darkness. And we got wind back. There was another holiness church in town that they were really upset with the Nazarene church. They were upset because those people were going to church there. You're like, okay, you lost me. Who are those people? Sharky's crowd. People that were hooked on meth. And a lot of them spent a lot of time in the church before they made any significant change. See, here was the thing that they were upset was the Sharky's crowd was coming to church, but they were still going to Sharky's. The meth crowd was coming to church, but they were still doing meth. Until I can't tell you which day it was or what message it was. All of a sudden, everything just kind of broke loose. And lives began to be radically changed. And it didn't look at all like it looked yesterday, and it didn't look at all like I thought it was going to look in the moment. But we had to get out of this idea of a box. And so I can remember having that conversation. They're like, well, don't you care what other churches think about you? I don't. I could care less what another person who's following Christ thinks about me if they're upset because I'm taking the word of truth to a world that needs it. Care less. I could care less that people think that I should think differently about somebody because of a lifestyle that they've chosen than I should think about somebody who's walking the straight and narrow. The last time I checked, I'm supposed to love absolutely everyone with the full love of God. And so as we think about that stuff, when we give into the status quo, when we refuse to spend all we have on the noble mission that God's given us, then what we do is we allow the enemy to steal from us. The enemy begins to steal our purpose. The enemy begins to help us think about how do we protect ourselves. The enemy gets us to a place where this is how do we hold on to our Christian heritage. And you know what? Jesus has been around for over 2,000 years, and there have been lots of opportunity for people to try to wipe Christianity off the map. There's been persecution after persecution, and it's still here. And to believe that man has any ability whatsoever to destroy who God is? Wake up, church. We're not that powerful. But when we allow the enemy to work in our lives, when we allow the enemy to steal from us what our mission is as the church, we start holding back. We start thinking about, do I really have enough arrows? We start thinking about ourselves. When the truth is this, is God desires us to save nothing for the next life. God desires us to save nothing for the next life. In the passage that we're going to look at today in 2 Kings, it's one of those obscure passages, and it's at the end of Elisha's life. The nation of Israel split between north and south. The kings have been very disobedient on both sides. And so we will have here is a guy by the name of King Jehoash. And King Jehoash is coming to Elijah because Elisha is sick. Elisha is going to die. And Jehoash is really upset about this, but not for the reasons that you would think. He's upset because if he loses Elisha, that's the only thing he really had, holding off everybody else. It wasn't a spiritual issue that Joash had. It was, you know what, if I lose Elisha, then Israel, the nation to the south, is going to overtake Judah. That was his sole purpose in being upset for Elisha. But what we'll have here is this is Elisha's last prophecy before he dies. It's a very, very obscure passage. You may not have ever read it before. If you had, you probably wonder, okay, what does this mean? And so we're going to read in 2 Kings chapter 13, starting at verse 14. It says, when Elisha was in his last illness, King Jehoash of Israel visited him and wept over him. My father, I see the chariots and the charioteers of Israel, he cried. Do you see right off the bat? He's not coming to Elisha saying, I'm so sorry you're sick. He's like, I'm looking to the north. I see Israel. I see their chariots. I see their soldiers. And you're getting ready to die. Help me. He was still coming for help. And so Elisha says, go get a bow and some arrows. The whole army's coming at him. Go get a bow and some arrows. And the king did as he was told. Elijah told him, put your hand on the bow. And Elisha laid his own hands on the king's hands. Then he commanded, open the eastern window. And he opened it. And he said, shoot. And so he shot an arrow. Elisha proclaimed, this is the Lord's arrow, an arrow of victory over Aram. for you will completely conquer the Arameans at Aphek. And so, just before we go on to verse 18, the arrow represented victory over his enemies. Very important that you think about this before we go on. Verse 18. Then he said, now pick up other arrows and strike them against the ground. So the king picked them up and he struck the ground 3 times. He had a whole bunch of arrows. The arrows represent what? Victory. He shot 3 arrows into the ground. And when we see the response of Elisha here, it says Elisha, the man of God, was angry with him. You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times, he exclaimed. Then you would have beaten Aram until he was entirely destroyed. Now you will be victorious only 3 times. In other words, what were you holding back? If the arrow represented victory and you really understood what I was saying to you and you really wanted victory, why didn't you shoot all the arrows you had? Why were you holding back? And then here's the crazy thing. When you read on, Elisha dies. That's the last prophecy that the king gets, is because you weren't willing to go all the way, you will not totally destroy the enemy. You will always be at war with the north until you die. And see, what I'm afraid of is that we live in a world right now where the church is not willing to go all of the way. And not in the ways that you might think. Sometimes when we hear the words, I want to go all the way, we have this idea of onward Christian soldiers and all that kind of stuff, but that isn't what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is victory comes through the love of Jesus Christ. And some of us are only willing to love so far. Some of us are only willing to go so far until it gets a little bit uncomfortable, till it gets a little bit outside of my comfort zone, till it gets a little bit to the place where you know what, I'm struggling just enough that it's a little bit of a sacrifice. And when we feel a little bit pain, when we start to question some things that we've held on to, somehow we think it's okay then to hold back a little bit. When if we believe that the love of God is above all things, why wouldn't we go all the way? Why wouldn't we love our enemies? Oh, I do. Oh, no, you don't. Why won't we love that person who makes our life just a little bit difficult? Oh, yeah, I love that person. No, you don't. Well, what if I go all the way and just decide that no matter what anybody else thinks, no matter what anybody else desires of me, all that truly matters is that I would mimic my Savior. That I would embrace Emmanuel. And I would show the same love that he showed in the same out-of-the-box way that he showed it to every single person that I come into contact with. What if God is looking for people to not save anything for this life? Save nothing for this life. My last my last college football game, We were terrible. I think I've told you before, we were 0-10 my first year. The next year we were 1-9, and the last 2 years we were 0-10. It was my very last game. And I can still remember playing Graceland College up in Lamona, Iowa. There's no other reason to go to Lamona, Iowa except to play football. It was cold. They were up by 2 touchdowns. It was like a minute 30 left, and we had 0 goose egg. I had convinced my coach to let me stay on the field because, as a senior, I wanted to play all the way, and he was taking everybody out. But I convinced him to let me stay on the field, and I had it in my mind that if everything worked out just right, that at least we could score. And so they were at the place, though, where like a minute and something left, where they were just kneeling down. They didn't have to run any other plays. And so what did I do? Much to the disappointment and embarrassment of my head coach, I just started calling timeout. We had 3. I just started calling timeout, thinking they got to run a play. They could fumble the ball on the snap. I could make a great play and grab the ball away from the running back and make a game, at least score a touchdown. And, I had all these ideas of grandeur in my mind. And so I started calling timeout. And every time I called timeout, my coach is on the side like, what are you doing? Some of my friends are looking down on the ground. He's embarrassing himself. And so I did. I risked everything. I risked what coaches thought. I risked being embarrassed. And I risked all that kind of stuff. And then I had to come to a place in my Christian walk where all that comes together is if I was willing to embarrass myself, if I was willing to risk ridicule, if I was willing to do all those things for a stupid football game, why am I not willing to do that for Jesus? The most important thing in my life, I say. You see, what we have to do, if we truly save nothing for this life, is we have to adapt and adventure for Jesus. You see, we live in a world that a lot of us just don't recognize anymore. We grew up in a world where it seems like Christianity was the focus of life. That's no longer that way. People are not Christ-centered. The church is no longer the cultural center of a community. And the way people process or think nowadays is just different. And I want to tell you something, that's not a good thing, that's not a bad thing. It's just the reality of the world that we live in. It is different than what we ever thought it was going to be. And there is nothing that I can do to change that. And so what we tend to do as Christians is we hibernate and we pull into ourselves and we say we're just going to wait for Jesus to come, or we're going to wait for people to come to their senses. One of the two. And we slowly die and become self-centered and don't have anything to give because we are wishing for something that was or that's never going to be. Instead of just abandoning ourselves to Jesus. To really trusting Him. It's so great to trust in Jesus. We sing the song. We love the song. But to trust Him, that's really different. You see, what this really is it's not something that we should be afraid of, but it's an opportunity for us to embrace God and continue to give all that we have toward being the missional arm of God in this world. God did not call the church to be a hiding place. He called us to be actively engaged in a world that's in desperate need. And I gotta wonder, and these are the questions I want you to ponder as we close things up this morning. Is it possible that God is waiting for someone or a group of someones to do more than is asked or imagined Is it possible that God is still looking for people who refuse to settle for the safe and the status quo or the comfortable? Is it possible that whatever stage of life that you're in, that He's waiting on you? Is it possible that He's waiting on me? Is it possible that that group of someones is us? I don't think it's just possible. I think it's probable. I think He's calling His church in Broken Arrow to be the church. For some of us, that means that we have to forgive some things. See, the thing is probably keeping some of us from really buying into everything I'm talking about, because as I'm talking, you're like, oh yeah, it makes sense. And some of us may even think we're there. But what's keeping us is maybe there's some forgiveness that needs to take place on our end towards someone or a group of someones. The quiver is full. The victories are sure, but we're holding back. For some of us, it's this sense of spiritual pride. We bought into this idea that if I do this and I do that, and if I just hold true, then I'm good enough for God, and that's really the most important thing. It's that individualization of the gospel, which, yes, God did die for you individually, but He died for the entire world. The quiver is full. The victories are sure. See, the crazy thing about an arrow is this, is that an arrow has no value at all until you let it go. And so this morning, I'm going to open the altars. I don't know how many of you may need to respond, but you're tired of just existing. And you know that God's powerful. You know that God wants to do something through you, and you know that God wants to do something through Broken Arrow Church of the Nazarene, but you also know that maybe you are the one. It's choosing to keep your quiver full. What do you need to get rid of to start shooting arrows until there is nothing left? Would you stand with me? If you need to let go of something, or if you just need to come and pray and seek God, the altars are open for you. Just come now. Is there forgiveness that you're holding back? It's not hurting anybody but you. The altars are open. Come. Forgive. Is your relationship with Christ this morning far from where you want it to be? You can fix that. Come. Let God mend that relationship.